Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here. I'm Vicki Wilkins, and I'm the Dean of the School of Public Affairs here at American University. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here this evening for this exciting and important event. We are so fortunate to have our distinguished visitors with us, Professor Robert George and Professor Cornel West, and it's truly an honor to be in their presence tonight and hear from them on these important topics. As the School of Public Affairs, we accept the responsibility that we need to convene important conversations about the nature of education and the importance of free speech, the values we hold as a school and as a university. We'd like to thank our co-sponsors for sharing this commitment and responsibility with us, the Kennedy Political Union, AU College Republicans, Alpha Phi Alpha, and Students for Free Expression. And a special thanks goes to the Institute of Humane Studies for helping us fund this evening's event. I just want to take 1 minute for a very important and exciting announcement from the School of Public Affairs. I'm proud to announce that we are creating the Lincoln Scholars Program. This program will be a certificate program in liberal education for freshmen and sophomores. SPA faculty have developed the program, and we are hoping to bring our first class of scholars in for fall of 2019. This program is designed around 3 big pillars. The first is that the program will make political and intellectual diversity a priority. This is going to be a program where you will meet someone you disagree with, where we're going to have liberals and conservatives, religious students and secular students, and a bunch of students who don't even fit in any of those categories, coming together to learn. Students in the program will also read hard books and have small discussion-based seminars around these readings. Some of the books are going to be the classics you might expect, like Plato, Shakespeare, and Locke. But you're also going to have more contemporary books there, like Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Ralph Ellison. In addition, the program is going to build an intellectual community that gathers around the seminar table, but also outside of the classroom. So we're hoping to offer each student in the program a small scholarship each year they complete. And we'll be having guest speakers and hosting retreats for students in the program every year. We're excited to bring this to AU and excited what it will mean for our students and our faculty to come together around these important topics. And I don't want to turn over the floor until I give a huge thanks to the leadership of the School of Public Affairs Political Theory Institute. I'd like to thank Tom Merrill for his leadership and Alan Levine. Thank you so much. We appreciate all you do to bring us together. Thank you. Now enjoy the show.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Othniel Harris. I'm the Director of Education Initiatives for the New Beta chapter of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, co-sponsor of this event. And I will be introducing our keynote speakers. Robert George. Robert George is one of America's most profound legal scholars and public intellectuals. He is the author of many books, including Making Men Moral and Conscience and Its Enemies. He served on many government commissions, including the President's Council on Bioethics and the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, where he was the chairman. Currently, he is the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence in the Department of Politics at Princeton University, and he is also the founding director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions. Robert George. Cornel West. Dr. Cornel West has held professorships at several top universities. He is currently the Professor Emeritus at Princeton University and Professor of the Practice of Public Philosophy at Harvard University. He is the author of books such as Race Matters and Democracy Matters. His most recent book, Black Prophetic Fire, is about the visionary legacies of Black leaders in the 19th and 20th centuries. From protests to television appearances, he makes sure to spread his message of love and justice everywhere he goes. Their moderator will be Dr. Thomas W. Merrill. AU's own professor, Thomas Merrill, who is an associate professor of government in the School of Public Affairs. He is the director of special programs for the Political Theory Institute. Professor Merrill is the author and co-editor of several books, including most recently, The Political Theory of the Civil War. I would like to thank Professor Merrill for allowing me to give the introductions of such distinguished speakers. I would also like to thank Shauna Burton of KPU for allowing us to be a co-sponsor here. And I also would like to thank Robert George and Dr. West for coming to our university. Thank you.
Thank you, Othniel, and thank you, Vicki, and thanks to all of you for coming. I am Tom Merrill, and I'm going to be moderating, by which I think my job is to simply get out of the way of our guests. The other thing, I thought about wearing a suit this morning, but then I thought I'm going to be on a stage with Robbie George and Cornel West, and that would be a competition that I would not like to be in. So these guys have been doing this conversation at many different places in the country. They've been preaching the gospel to many different schools and kinds of schools. I think one thing that I'm hoping that we're going to do here today is try to bring the conversation back to some of the things that are happening here at AU and have some questions that are coming out of our experience here at AU. And we're going to try to do some things that are a little bit different than what they've done before, just so that we shake things up a little bit. So another way of saying that is we haven't rehearsed this, so if it goes badly, then you should blame somebody else. I'm just going to start with the obvious question for most of us here at AU for this topic, which is most people come to AU because it's in Washington, D.C., and because they're hoping that they're going to get a job in Washington, D.C., that they want to work on the Hill or they want to work in the nonprofit sector, right? And that's great. That's our bread and butter for what we do here at the university. Now that creates a little bit of a problem when students are here and they think my main job is doing an internship, and you're in your intro political theory class and you're trying to persuade them to read Book 1 of the Republic and talking about Thrasymachus. And the students look at me and they say, why are you doing this? Why are you making me do this? So my first question to our guests is, what should I say to the students who don't want to read Book 1 of the Republic?
Well, first, let me thank the Wilkins and Professor Merrill and Professor Levine for the opportunity to this is my second visit to the American University. The first was about a decade ago, and I see that the university has only gone from strength to strength, so it's really an honor to be here. And of course, it is always an honor to be in conversation with my dear brother, Professor Cornel West. Cornel is not only a dear friend and brother, but he is an inspiration to me. He is our nation's premier public intellectual, whether of the left or the right. He is our premier public intellectual. And his work as a scholar and as a scholar who is engaged in public life and in public dialogue has certainly been an inspiration to me. We began teaching together at Princeton in 2017. We've been at it now for 11 years, and even though he has now abandoned me for Harvard, we still continue to have these opportunities to get together and to reflect together and to challenge each other and to sometimes lock arm in arm in particular causes that we share. We disagree about a few things, but we also agree very fundamentally about some other things. We put out a statement a couple of years ago. Many of your faculty members and others around the country signed, some students, called Truth-Seeking Democracy and Freedom of Thought and Expression. And what we said there will be really the substance of much of our conversation here today. We published something not long ago together on the witness, the biblical witness of Reverend Martin Luther King. We've worked together on a variety of projects, and it's always a joy and a pleasure. And for me, the reason for that has as much to do, if not more to do, with this man's integrity than with his formidable and powerful intellect. If you're in the academic field, you meet a lot of really smart people. There are tons of really smart people. But you don't meet in any field of endeavor, academia, business, politics, religion, you name it, you don't meet a lot of people when push comes to shove, they exemplify integrity and principle, and that's what Cornel does, and that's what makes him such an inspiration for me. So my brother, I am so delighted again to be together with you. Yeah, God bless you.
There it is, my brother.
Amen. Now to your question, Professor Merrill. Education is about informing yourself. It's about information. It's about learning skills, including reading and thinking skills, reading critically, thinking critically. That's very important. Indeed, it's indispensable. And education, certainly higher education, has an important role to play in credentialing people and preparing them for careers. I'm not here to deny any of that. But I'm here to affirm something. And that is that at the most fundamental level, the kind of education that is available to you at the American University and available to our students at Harvard and Princeton and available to many other students around the country at many other institutions, state and private, the most important thing is the availability of an opportunity to lead the examined life, to think about the deep existential questions of meaning and value, to ask, where do we come from? What's the significance of a human life? What is our nature? What is our destiny? Do we have a dignity that is something special, something above what we might ascribe to inanimate objects, or to plants, or to animals? Human beings have any specific dignity, anything that makes us worth more than merely material things are worth. Those are critical questions that every human being should raise. And people raise them and have raised them whether or not they had available to them a liberal arts education. But you who are students here have available to you a liberal arts education. And when I say available, I use that word advisedly. It's available, but that doesn't mean you'll get it. Whether you get it is up to you. Whether you seize the opportunities. They can force you into a class where you read Plato's Republic and learn who Thrasymachus was. But they can't actually make you explore the question that is at issue, or set of questions that at issue between Socrates and Thrasymachus in the Republic. And those questions are the most important questions. And they can't be answered by learning information or acquiring skills, even the skills of critical thinking. You can treat those texts like museum pieces. You can do philology. But that's not really what you're being invited to do if you're taking advantage of the opportunity, the availability of a liberal arts education. If you're doing that, you are engaging with those authors. Thrasymachus and Socrates are your interlocutors in a conversation where you're trying to figure out what it's all about. Now, if you're getting a liberal arts education, if you want a liberal arts education, it is a deep education. What my brother calls paideia, deep education, going beyond mere information and skills. Oh, okay, thank you, brother.
Make sure we hear you.
Now we won't be able to hear you.
Now I'm doubled up. If you're getting that, then, well, I'll tell you how you know whether you're getting it. Are you being challenged in your fundamental beliefs, in your political and religious and moral beliefs, no matter what they are, no matter whether you're a theist or an atheist, whether you are Christian or Jewish or Muslim or Buddhist or Hindu or Sikh, whether you are progressive or a conservative? If you are not being challenged on those fundamental issues, if you are not being made uncomfortable, if not, you are not being unsettled, if there are not professors and fellow students who are doing that for you, then you are not getting an education, not getting a liberal education. And if you're getting a liberal education, by the time you are juniors and certainly by the time you are seniors, you will be raising those challenging questions and unsettling yourself. You won't have to rely, so it'd still be good to have friends around and faculty around who challenge you from all sorts of different perspectives. But if you're getting it, you will find yourself moved to challenge and unsettle yourself. Now, to say what I just said means that you are paying, what's it cost here, $64,000? You are paying that to be made very uncomfortable. Your parents are paying that, or your scholarship is paying that, or the generous donors to the American University. I would encourage any who are here to, I would thank you for your generosity to this institution, encourage you to continue that generosity. But they are paying for you to be made very uncomfortable, because that is what an education is about. You probably know that old saying, that old aphorism, that it's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Well, that saying captures a profound truth. To lead a truly human life in the highest sense means to be uncomfortable and to be challenging yourself and questioning no matter where you are. I'll just make a final point before I hand it over to Cornel. And that is, none of this questioning means that you should adopt the stance of moral relativism or skepticism or subjectivism. That too should be subjected to criticism and scrutiny and challenge, that position too. Nor does it mean that you should not be engaged politically, religiously, or that you should not aspire to work for whatever you believe justice is, whether you're on the conservative side or the progressive side or whatever. It doesn't mean that. You can do these things. You can lead the examined life and be engaged. Cornel does it. I try to do it. But what it does mean is that you will always be open to the challenge, and you will never see the challenge as an assault. That your fundamental love will be for truth. The truth about justice, the truth about what is right. Truth itself. You will understand truth not merely as an instrument, and you will certainly understand education not merely as an instrument to something else, getting a good job, or even bringing about justice. You'll understand truth as something inherently enriching of you as a person and of your fellow human beings. You will understand the value of truth for its own sake, and because you love truth, you will love truth more than you love opinions. That is the vaccine, the immune system to prevent you, prevent me, prevent Cornel from falling so deeply in love with our own opinions that we refuse to be or will not want to be challenged. That is the recipe for avoiding dogmatism. Be engaged, but don't be dogmatic. Be challenged, allow yourself to be challenged. Demand that this university challenge you. Demand it to be its best self in doing that. Even while you fight for what you do believe in, or you worship God as you do understand God, or not if you do not believe in God, but always with an openness to being challenged and to getting at the truth. You can be comfortable, you can rest comfortably if that's what you want to do in any opinion. You can feel good about yourself. You can be satisfied in that sense with any opinion, what religious opinion, political opinion, moral opinion. You can get comfortable with that. But you shouldn't be. You should constantly be challenging, constantly be open. Okay, over to you, brother.
Testing. Yes, let me first say I am just blessed to be here at American University. You all have done such wonderful things here and forces for good, I'm sure, in various ways. Each and every one of you want to begin by saluting my dear brother, Professor Merrill, distinguished political theorist that he is, the Sister Dean Wilkins. I salute your courageous leadership in this place. I know you just got off the plane to Los Angeles and made a direct route here. That's a reflection of your deep dedication. Where's Brother Student Harris? Where is he? There he is. Yeah, indeed. I want to salute you as well when you march in May. What's the date for graduation?
May 11th.
Oh, you got it down, though, don't you? Yeah, indeed. That's a beautiful day for all of those graduating. And I haven't had a chance to meet my dear brother, Professor Levine. It was good to see you, my brother. Very much so. Each time I'm blessed to be on the same stage with my dear brother Robbie. I'm just full of fire. people don't understand the ways in which love is so much deeper than politics. That you can actually revel in somebody else's humanity, their humor, their intellect, their sense of being human, and still believe he's wrong on some things. And he believes I'm wrong on some things. But we overlap in fundamental ways in terms of rights and liberties and so forth and so on. But our families spend time together. We're able to socialize together, not just kind of superficial socialization among the chattering classes, but I'm talking about the deeper kinds of friendships in the Aristotelian sense, which is for the sake of the other. And that cuts much deeper than any agreement on policy. And you need to say that these days. We live in such polarized times. You lose sense of the humanity of the other. You see it within families. You see it within communities, within the same religious group. Certain Buddhists can't talk to certain Buddhists. Certain Jews can't talk to other Jews. Certain Catholics can't talk to other Catholics. I'm a Holy Ghost Baptist. But the Holy Ghost doesn't kick in too often sometimes. Some Baptists can't talk to other Baptists, and so forth and so on. And you see, the challenge of that book one, and the reason why the Socratic legacy of Athens is so rich, but usually so fragile, so weak, so feeble, is because when you come to a place like Washington, D.C., this is the power center of the country, of the empire. And if everything is about power, the first casualty is truth. And the second casualty is goodness. And the third casualty is beauty. And if you're religious like me and Brother Robbie, the fourth casualty is the holy. And what Thrasymachus represented, especially to that younger generation, who are eager to Socrates, tell us what justice really is. How do you bequeath the great treasures of the tradition of the past to the younger generation who are obsessed with power and status and wealth and money? 2018, USA. Can't wait to go to college in order to gain access to that diploma that enables you to live large in some vanilla suburb, titillated by your mansion and obsessed with your status. Now, I'm not talking about anybody in here, but there's some students somewhere around. I say the same thing at Princeton, Harvard, and so forth, you see. And what we are trying to do is to say, lo and behold, Socrates, not the sophist, the careerist, obsessed with the next opportunity, but Socrates with calling, with vocation, not just profession, with a love of truth and goodness and beauty. It beckons him to live a certain kind of life, to cut radically against the grain. That is not to say you can be a professional with a Socratic sensibility, but it's difficult to preserve those sensibilities in professional context. Because so much of it is about mobility, power, status, honor. And every generation has to fight this battle. Every generation. They say, well, Brother West, isn't it true that Socrates ends up with the hemlock and Thrasymachus goes away with much energy? Yes, it is. That's part of what paideia, deep education, is all about. Not cheap schooling, deep education. The formation of attending to things that matter rather than the superficial things. The cultivation of a critical consciousness that renders you oftentimes cutting against the grain, not just politically or religiously or ideologically, but existentially. The battle inside of you that you have to be honest about. It's not a matter of looking at somebody else and saying, lo and behold, there goes a white supremacist, as we saw in Charlottesville. But it's also a matter of saying, how do I deal with the white supremacy inside of me? Because I grew up in America, and there's white supremacy inside of black folk, as well as vanilla folk, as well as brown folk and red folk. It's part of what it is to be modern and American. Same is true with patriarchy. Same is true with homophobia, transphobia. How do you fight these things inside of you? So Socrates is saying to the younger generation, Thrasymachus makes right. Power determines morality, you see. Whoever has the canons determines what ethics are. The golden rule is cast out. And whoever has the goal dictates the rules. The great Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel used to say, if you view life as a golden rush, or as a gold rush, you're going to end up worshiping the golden calf. That's part of the legacy of Jerusalem. How do you keep track of the idols, the idolatry that gets in the way of the quest for truth and goodness and beauty? This is not just rhetoric. This is not just rhetoric. The condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak. The truth about your own life has to do with what do you do with your suffering. Will it be expressed in such a way that you trash the most vulnerable and refuse to confront the most powerful? Will you demonize other folk that don't look like you? Do you have the capacity to keep track of human beings outside of national borders so that a baby in Yemen and a baby in Gaza and a baby in Tel Aviv and a baby in Baltimore has exactly the same value? These are the kind of challenges, and none of us ever fully embody it. We fall short. Try again, fail better. That's our dear brother Samuel Beckett. He's absolutely right. Try again, fail better. So when we talk about that first chapter, the first thing to say to young folk is, this is no game. You recall how Thrasymachus walks away? He doesn't even care what the real conclusion is. And Socrates tells him, this is no game. This is about my life. I've got one life to live from womb to tomb. Everything's at stake. This is not a matter of some abstract gesturing that makes me look smart in the culture of smartness. Let the phones be smart. You got to learn how to be wise. Socrates is about wisdom. It's not about smartness. And Socrates said, lo and behold, he's not really interested in the deep dialogue. He just wants the superficial chatter to allow me to be head of my in-group so that I can have my upward mobility in my in-group, whatever it is. Conservative, centrist, liberal, left, whatever, religious, whatever it is. No, think for yourself. Learn how to love the truth and goodness and beauty. Learn how to love your neighbor. I'm a Christian. I'm trying to love my enemies. That's a difficult one. I need a whole lot of thick grace, but we won't get theological at the moment. But this is real. This is what Martin King was about. This is what Fannie Lou Hamer was about. This is what shaped me in Shiloh Baptist Church on the chocolate side of Sacramento, California. I hated black people who taught the world so much about what love really is from below. And if we lose that tradition, lose that legacy, it's all about Thrasymachus. It's all about might makes right. It's all about survival of the slickest, survival of those who can lie the best, survival of those who are able to hide their criminality behind their mendacity. Much is at stake. Our lives, the future of American democracy, maybe given the ecological catastrophe, the future of the planet is at stake. And, well, is that enough, Brother West? I would think so for all of us.
I'm not sure how to follow up on that. You want to say something?
Well, you got your...
Yeah, so I want to give Cornel an opportunity to say to this audience some things that I find myself very powerful. First, just a point about vocation and profession. So what's the difference? What's the difference? Sometimes the term vocation is just used as a synonym for profession. A vocation is a calling. And what's fundamental about a vocational calling is that it's a calling to serve. It's a calling to serve others. Now, people are called to different things. Not everybody's called to the same thing. Vocation is, I'm a Catholic. Vocation's a big term within the Catholic Church. And when I was a little boy, I remember that the term became synonymous with a religious vocation, with being a priest or being a nun, the consecrated life. But that was a mistake on Catholic terms even back then, because the sound understanding religiously, and I think we can secularize this and it means the same thing, is that everybody has a vocation, everybody has a calling, and part of that exploration that goes into the examined life is figuring out, what am I called to do? Given the distinctive talents, opportunities, the distinctive skills, the circumstances, the resources that are available to me. How am I being called to serve others? It might be in a law firm. It might be in a big, prestigious corporate law firm. It might be. But there's where you have to keep Cornel's warning in mind. You very well might be tempted to dress up whatever your desire for comfort and wealth and status is in the language of vocation, in the language of serving. The self-critical attitude needs to be there if you're to avoid falling into that trap. So vocation and profession. But now, Cornel, I would like to toss you the question. What is liberal arts education fundamentally for? What is it training you for? It's teaching you to do what?
To learn how to die.
There it is.
That's it.
Now, there it is.
That's it. To learn how to die.
Can we put that as a learning outcome?
That was nice, though, brother. That was nice. That was nice. But no, but it's a process. You see, when Plato says philosophy, love of wisdom, is a meditation on and preparation for death. When the great Montaigne says to philosophize is to learn how to die. Seneca says he or she who learns how to die unlearns slavery. It is a process because when you critically examine yourself and give up certain assumptions and presuppositions, that's a form of death. And there is no maturation, there's no development, there's no growth without that kind of death. Dorothy Day, one of the great prophetic figures of the 20th century, and in her eulogy for Martin Luther King Jr., April 5th, 1968, Catholic Day worker, Martin Luther King Jr. learned how to die every day because there's an echo in the New Testament of a Jewish brother named Paul who wrote letters to Rome and said Christians must die daily. Now, what does that mean? That education is an endless process of a quest for truth. If you're involved in a quest for truth, then parts of their ignorance must learn how to die. No matter how learned you are, Nicholas of Cusa talked about learned ignorance, didn't he? And we need to hear that dialogue among our professors. No matter how learned you are, we keeping track of your ignorance. We keeping track of your blindnesses. Maybe the paradigm that you've been socialized into is missing certain insights or downplaying other people's suffering. You need to broaden out. Each and every one of us are shot through with parochialism and provincialism. And we all have to learn how to die to perennially attempt to expand and grow. And I love what you say when you talk about vocation being democratized. And we would tell our young people that do not graduate without reading Emerson's American Scholar or the Divinity School Address, because he talks about the diversity of every person undergoing education in the quest for moral, spiritual excellence, which is distinctively yours, just like a jazz musician. Your voice only, just like your fingerprint. You see, it's all yours. You see. And then after that, I want you to read the 2 essays in Munich of Max Weber's on politics as vocation and science of vocation in 1917, 1919 essays. There's something in the best of the past that must be mobilized and deployed in order to keep alive the best in the present. The fighting for a cause is not just about victory. It's about keeping alive the best. The same is true with Amos and Isaiah and the prophetic legacy of Jerusalem. How do you keep alive that best? But it takes courage because it's coming at you. You stand under judgment. Your country stands under judgment. We as human beings stand under judgment. And then there's always Eugene O'Neill sitting in Harry Hope's Saloon and Iceman Cummins that says, don't expect too much out of human beings. You can't create a marble temple out of a mixture of mud and manure. Human nature is so wretched. They don't even have the will to cultivate a quest for truth, will to cultivate the quest for goodness. It's all about power all the way down. That's Eugene O'Neill's challenge. That's part of being educated. That's why nihilism ought to be something you wrestle with the way Jacob wrestled with the angel of night in the 32nd chapter of Genesis. It doesn't go away. Would you agree with that, though, brother?
100%. And this means facing up to the challenge of those who challenge our belief that there is something greater, more important, more holy than power. The challenge coming from someone like Nietzsche. If you haven't read Nietzsche, especially those of us who are religiously devout, if we haven't read the greatest atheist of the modern times, if we haven't let him challenge us, if we haven't genuinely confronted him, I don't mean just read through so you can pass a test, genuinely taken on board his powerful critique of belief, his defense of the idea that it's all about power in the end, you are not living the examined life.
So I have a question. Well, maybe I'll start with a question for you, Robbie. So this is powerful stuff, right? And this is the stuff that our students need to learn. But I want to ask you a question about conservative students in particular. We've known each other for quite some time. We're colleagues in the Bush administration, right? We've known each other since then, and we know a lot of conservative folks. Conservatives, I guess I'm interested in the phenomenon of what you might call the conservative provocateur that we've seen quite a bit in the past few years. And the way that it goes is something like this. All conservatives complain about political correctness. That's almost the definition. And so a student will come to you and they'll say, well, I'm not being allowed to say this thing that I really believe. Can I say it? And you'll say, okay, well, what is it? And they'll say, well, they'll have something that's vaguely annoying. And you think, okay, well, we could probably tolerate this thing that you want to say. And then they come back right in that same moment, and they're like, well, what about this other thing that's even more annoying, right? And you get into the cycle where they keep coming back and asking for more and more, and pretty soon you get to a point where they're saying something that is profoundly offensive, right? And it feels like a little bit like a very unpleasant version of the game Mother May I, right? Where you're on this escalator where somebody's gonna, and it seems to be that the point is to say something that is gonna be offensive to somebody. So I guess I'm wondering what if your sense is like mine, but it seems to me, I mean, it seems to me there's a sign of something afoot and not for good on the conservative side of things. But I guess the more important question for this conversation is, isn't that a kind of misunderstanding of what liberal education is, maybe even a kind of corruption of what liberal education is? Can you tell us what to think about that?
I think you've actually described it correctly. It's a corruption of what liberal education is. To provoke someone just to provoke them is understandable in certain circumstances where you feel such an oppression of ideology. You feel that there's such a groupthink going on that you're just motivated to say something outrageous in order to shake things up. It's understandable. But that's really not what I'm talking about when I mean confront each other, challenge each other, allow each other to be challenged. Allow yourself to be challenged. Conservative students or liberal students, they've got to allow themselves to be challenged in a way that makes it possible that they're not going to end up on the same side where they began. I've analogized in conversations with Cornel before the situation to getting on a train, not knowing where you're going to get off the train, and maybe not even knowing that you might not even recognize yourself, or your old friends might not even, or your old ideological allies might not even recognize you when you get off that train, because there's something about the journey that has been transformative. Now, you don't need me to tell you that there is a battle going on within conservatism now for what conservatism is, what it means. Donald Trump has made that happen. And it's a big fight, and I think conservatives need to take that very seriously. And from my point of view, it's very important that the right side win this. But there's also the need for conservative students to challenge their liberal peers, but not, or progressive peers, but not by just gratuitous provocation, by exposing them, doing the service of exposing their progressive peers to the best that has been thought and said, to use Matthew Arnold's language, on the conservative side. So I want to know from my conservative students first, before we even ask the progressive students, okay, well, have you read Edmund Burke? Have you or not? If you haven't, then come back and ask me the question after you've read Reflections on the Revolution in France. Now, have you read Friedrich Hayek? Cornel and I have taught him in our courses together. Well, if you haven't, you're not going to have a lot to say to your progressive
friends, about a lot of very important issues. You should do the service of provoking, if by provoking we mean the Socratic, gadfly kind of provoking, that's based on deep thinking and understanding and reading the best that has been thought and said. But provoking just to provoke, no, that's a burlesque of what liberal education should be about. And everything I've said about conservative students applies on the other side as well to liberal students. Now, I would say to liberal students basically the same thing I say to conservative students. If I'm with a group of progressive students, usually they have read at least something by Marx. Usually not Capital. That's a heavy lift. You know, but they've read something. Maybe the Manifesto with Engels. Maybe the Gotha program. Maybe on the Jewish question. You know, there's something there. But I have the same question. Have you read Burke? Have you read Hayek? And if the answer is no, then I say, well, how do you know you're a progressive? You don't know yet. You haven't read the stuff that would enable you to decide between the competing points of view on a whole range of very important questions. So our students should be reading Marx, whether they're conservatives or progressives, should be reading Marx, but also reading Burke. They should be reading Dewey, but they should also be reading C.S. Lewis. They should be reading Rawls, but they should also be reading McIntyre. That's what an education is all about.
Absolutely.
You want a question, Cornel?
No, I think he's telling the truth, but I think it's easier said than done. It's easier said than done. It takes a lot of fortitude. You know, fortitude is more than courage. See, a Nazi soldier can be courageous and still be a thug and a gangster. I saw some very courageous neo-Nazis in Charlottesville who wanted to crush us like cockroaches. And I admired their courage. I just didn't want to necessarily be the victim. But they didn't have any fortitude in terms, there was not a moral and spiritual dimension to their courage. The cause that they were committed to was a thuggish cause of hatred and contempt and domination. So that on the one hand, there's a sense in which what Robbie's talking about is like the conclusion of a practical Aristotelian syllogism, which is not a proposition, but it's an action and a life lived. It's a way of being in the world. And the only way you can cultivate a way of being in the world is to cultivate a way of being in the world, to live it over and over through praxis, through a certain kind of habit and so forth. And we're living at a time where conformity and orthodoxy and rigidity is so overwhelming that people tend to want to fit into those rather than be true to something bigger than all of us, which is truth and goodness and beauty. And that's why the conversation has to be broad. A variety of different voices. I come from a people whose anthem of black people, lift every voice. Now, what does it mean to lift every voice? Well, voice is different than an echo. If you're just going to be an echo and a copy, you're not going to add to the conversation. We want to know what you think. Don't just reflect what somebody else thinks. We want thermostats who shape the climate of opinion. We don't want thermometers. Just reflect it. You can run into conservatives. Just hear the Fox News points. No, I want a conversation. I just don't want pontification. Run into these neoliberals. You just hear the MSNBC points. No, leave that for Rachel. I want to know what you got to say. And it goes on and on and on. How do you actually become jazz-like? And when you're jazz-like, you got enough discipline so you can improvise and find your own voice. So you learn something from Rachel, then you learn something from Fox News. You mean you can learn something from Fox News? Well, it's going to take a long time to really listen very, very, very closely. But yes, you can. And of course, Fox News is nowhere near the Edmund Burkes and the Chestertons and others who are highly sophisticated conservative thinkers, or Brother Robbie himself. And so that's one of the problems these days. When you think about conservatism, you think of the dumbed-down version. You don't think of sophisticated conservatism. Or you think of what it is to be a leftist, like myself. You think of the dumbed-down version of leftism. You don't think of more subtle versions that are open to criticism and acknowledging that one can be wrong in that regard. And we're seeing this now with the Marc Lamont Hill situation. How do we have a robust conversation on a set of issues that are so delicate and so difficult? How do you have a double love? So you come into the conversation saying, I'm going to love Palestinian brothers and sisters the way I'm going to love Jewish brothers and sisters. I'm going to love Jewish brothers and sisters the way I love Palestinian brothers and sisters, which means I'm going to try to empathize and get inside of their skin. What is it really to be part of a unique history of Jewish brothers and sisters? 2,000 years, spit on, despised, persecuted, subjugated, pogroms, ghettos, holocausts, and so forth. The need for security, deep suspicion of anybody who would call into question security, with 1 out of 3 of them being killed just less than 100 years later. An underdog mentality, and then shift to 1948 and 1967. Well, lo and behold, now you got a people with an underdog mentality, no longer the underdogs in a particular region of the world in which there's Palestinians who have been subjugated. And the debate between our Jewish brothers and sisters, Jabotinsky on the one hand, let's dominate, we can't trust anybody, echoes of Thrasymachus. Albert Einstein, Ahakaha, Judah Magnus, and others. No, as Jews, we must coexist. We have a prophetic legacy. We must learn to live with. We must create some kind of community that cuts beyond group and tribe. Is that even feasible? That's a serious discussion, especially when people's lives are at stake. Well, let's have a conversation about that in such a way that it's not anti-Jewish in its hatred, anti-Palestinian hatred, keeps track of the humanity across the board, but also keeps track of the structures of domination in place, of occupation, however, whatever form we can talk, patriarchy, whatever it is. How do we have that dialogue in the United States? How do we have it in Tel Aviv? How do you have it in Gaza? How do you have it in the West Bank? How does that Socratic energy to be enacted? What kind of prophetic witness will there be? Is there even any chance of nonviolent prophetic witness left in such a situation? Or will it just be violence across the board? These are the kinds of very, very crucial issues. And what Brother Robbie and I are saying is, it's very important that the voices be lifted, but each voice must be rendered accountable, answerable, in serious dialogue, based on evidence, argument, data, vision, and so on. And I think, right now, it could be even a positive thing that we have this kind of discussion in regard to this particular issue with Brother Marc Lamont Hill. But he's just a catalyst.
Yeah.
He's just a catalyst.
Dr. George, do you want to talk a little bit about Marc Lamont Hill and fill in, I think a lot of people might not know, but since I know you've been tweeting about it, the other form of our conversation.
Well, I don't know about other people, but when I say that I am for academic freedom and freedom of speech, I mean it. And I mean it for people across the spectrum. It's what I believe. When Brother Cornel and I put out our statement on truth-seeking democracy and freedom of thought and expression, we meant what we said there. And that means there needs to be a very robust dialogue, and we need to defend the right to participate in that dialogue in a robust way of people who disagree with us. Now, sometimes people are going to go over the line. There's no question about that. Sometimes people are going to say things that are hurtful and that they shouldn't say. Or they're going to use phrases, or they're going to associate with people they shouldn't be associating with. And all of that should be subjected to criticism. Absolutely should be subjected to criticism. Absolutely. But that's different from firing people for their advocacy, especially in the context of a university where there should be academic freedom. And so although on the substantive policy questions, should there be a one-state solution or a two-state solution, Marc Lamont Hill and I are not on the same page. Brother Cornel and I are not on the same page. We believe a lot in common. A Jewish baby and a Palestinian baby are of exactly equal value. Everybody's rights have to be protected. But we disagree on some policy things. Cornel said those are delicate questions, important and delicate questions. But despite my differences with Marc Lamont Hill, I immediately said that I, myself personally, would organize a protest if Temple University fired him. Now, it's not just Israel. I imagine Marc Lamont Hill and I disagree about almost everything. We probably disagree about more stuff than Cornel and I disagree about. But that doesn't mean that I should stand aside while his academic freedom rights and free speech rights are denied, in fact, it should be people on the other side who are the first in line to defend the rights of their intellectual or ideological adversaries. I wasn't doing anything special in rushing to Mark Lamont Hill's defense. At least I shouldn't be interpreted that way. I was just doing what I should have been doing, in the same way that people on the left should be in the forefront when the free speech rights or the academic freedom rights on this campus or any campus of conservatives are called into question.
That's right.
Academic freedom belongs to people on the left. It belongs to people on the right. It belongs to people who want a one-state solution and people with a two-state solution. Pro-life, pro-choice. It belongs to everybody, and it belongs to everybody equally, and we've got to protect it. It's a very, very delicate thing. And without it, if we let it go, if we don't honor it, all that challenging that I was talking about that's essential, that's central to education, can't happen. It can't happen. If people feel they have to keep their mouths shut, not say what's really on their minds for fear of being vilified, being attacked, being fired, then that challenging isn't going on. I mean, if your fundamental, I don't care again whether you're left or right, whether you're with Mark Lamont Hill or with somebody on the other side, if your fundamental beliefs are not being challenged, if there are not professors challenging your fundamental beliefs, no matter what they are, your most cherished beliefs, your most identity-forming beliefs, if they're not challenging, go to the president of this university and demand a refund, because you're not getting an education. I won't ask you to raise hands, but I could ask you to raise hands and say, how many of you have had professors who have challenged your fundamental political opinions all the way down? If you haven't, pay a visit to the president. How many of you have had your fundamental moral beliefs on key issues, on hot-button issues, challenged by members of the faculty? If not, you deserve a refund. No, I'm trusting that because I know some faculty members here, there are faculty members available to you who will challenge your beliefs. But then the next step is the onus is on you. If you avoid those professors, shame on you. You should be flocking to their classes.
I want to ask Dr. West a question about race and how race intersects with this liberal education thing. I don't think I'm going to surprise anyone if I say we Americans have a hard time talking about race, and that oftentimes in the university, right, and I blame myself sometimes for this, we get into a defensive crouch where we don't want to talk about stuff. We'd rather talk about almost anything else. Other times we go to the opposite extreme, and we act like, well, here's the answer. I'm going to give you a worksheet. You can fill out the worksheet. I'll give you the answer key, and that's the end of the story. Do you think liberal education can help us have those conversations about race, and if so, how?
I think part of it has to do with the voices that are available. I've heard talk about this wonderful class on inequality that'll be available to freshmen. And you just read Du Bois. Just take him home. Wrestle with him. Read some James Baldwin. Let Toni Morrison rock your soul and unsettle your mind in such a way that it'll remind you of what Hamlet did and what Dante's Inferno did. And that's a way of acknowledging the degree to which anytime you talk about the quest for truth in the United States, you're going to have to come to terms with the vicious legacy of white supremacy. And simply because the country itself has had a weak will to truth, let alone a weak will to justice, when it comes to white supremacy, oftentimes, you yourself as a student will be exposed to voices, arguments, visions. So the important thing to keep in mind is anytime you're talking about race, it's true for gender, it's true for class, it's true for empire. These are not diversity issues. See, we got these bureaucrats running around here chattering about diversity. I can't stand that. You see, I've never taught a diversity course in my life. I got a calling to engage in the quest for truth, small t, knowledge, small k, to try to alleviate a little bit of suffering and misery before the worms get in my body. So if I'm teaching courses about truth as it relates to black folk, oh my God, you're in the diversity. But if you're teaching about the Irish, oh, you're talking about the human condition. Hey, we love the Irish brothers and sisters, but that's what's true. Eugene O'Neill talks about the human condition. Lorraine Hansberry talks about race. Shakespeare talks about the human condition. Toni Morrison talks about race. Alice Walker talks about gender. No, all of them are human beings talking about truth, goodness, knowledge, beauty from certain contexts. And if whatever color they are, whatever gender they are, whatever sexual orientation they are, that's not an authority for truth. You got to think it through. You got to put your argument forward and so forth. So when, in fact, we talk about issues of race in America, it's just been so difficult because white supremacy cuts so deep that we rather take the easy way out, which is thrasymachus. Well, I really don't have to talk about it. It doesn't affect me that very much at all. You don't think so, huh? You don't think that mass incarceration, you don't think that decrepit schools, you don't think that levels of poverty on the other side of town are not linked to your destiny? Didn't Lincoln say, didn't Martin say our destinies are linked together? Sooner or later we hang together or hang separately? Chickens come home to roost, you know. That's another way of saying much is at stake when you're talking about liberal education as it relates to any form of losing track of humanity of people. It could be indigenous peoples. It could be precious trans folk. It could be gays and lesbians, Jews, Arabs, Muslims, Palestinians, Dalit peoples in India, so-called untouchables and so forth. All of them human beings, part of our curriculum concerned about truth, goodness, beauty in that sense. So the first thing is to de-ghettoize it. You see what I mean? Yes. This is not something special going on over here for chocolate folk. Oh, no. This is fundamental to the mission of this institution, any institution of higher learning. Now, if the Institute of Higher Learning says, we really deep down have no interest in the quest for truth and knowledge, we just into something else. Shut the place down, they wasting the money. But as long as they tied to truth, you got a hook. Lo and behold, you're going to have to broaden your discourse. Bring in the voices, the arguments.
So I'm hoping that we're going to have time for questions. I'm not sure if what the microphone situation is. We do have some microphones, and we are going to be taking some questions. And I guess I will. Okay, so we have some microphones. So before we start taking questions, I'm going to just remind you of certain facts. If you'd like to talk with Robbie George about the status of the embryo, we would love to have you come some other time and have that conversation. If you want to talk with Cornel West about democratic socialism, we would also love you to come some other time. Right now, we're having a conversation about liberal education and things that are happening on campus, our common culture. That's the focus here. So also remember that it should be a question with a question mark, and it should be short because there are lots of people who want to speak.
I have a question for Brother Cornel.
There we go. Yeah.
It's prompted really by the last set of comments, which I hadn't heard you make before, and I'm grateful to Tom for prompting them. My question is, do you think the decision to move in the direction of establishing cultural studies departments of various sorts played an important role in the ghettoization of authors like Toni Morrison, Du Bois, Baldwin, and we can do the same if we go to other sorts of gender studies and all sorts of things like that. I mean, you should be reading Baldwin in comparative literature and English literature.
Oh, absolutely.
You should be reading Du Bois in political science and in philosophy. If we regard those authors as authors that we study in the Black Studies Department or the African American Studies Department, then it seems like almost a license to say, well, that's being taken care of elsewhere. We don't need to take care of it in the political science department, comparative literature department, English literature department, sociology department, and so forth.
But I think you got the institutional history, the ways in which these departments had to emerge given the entrenchment of what was in place. I get that. When we understand that in terms of the white supremacy, the male supremacy, and so forth. The important thing, though, is how the courses are taught. That's the key. You can teach any course in any department, but if you do it in a sophisticated pedagogical way in which contexts are multi-layered, the arguments are subtle, and you're making the relations between present and past without falling into a presentism or losing sight of the best of the past, then you're still going to be able to give what the students ought to have. I've taught in prisons for 37 years. We don't worry about diversity courses in the prison. We start with Plato, we do Augustine, we do Lorraine Hansberry. Their favorite play is Always Waiting for Godot by Samuel Beckett. They want to spend 2 weeks on that. Then we go to Toni Morrison. Then we go to James Baldwin, you see. But it's how it's taught, the quality of the conversation, and the broadening of their minds, hearts, and souls, you see. But, I mean, now it's a larger issue in terms of the, the French occupation of the American mind that took place in the 80s, the narrowing of the intellectual provincialism, the loss even of American intellectual tradition of the Whitmans and the Muriel Rookeisers and the Edmund Wilsons and a whole host of others. That's a larger discussion of what happened in terms of the contraction that took place in terms of intellectual engagement. Even the critiques of colonialism and post-colonialism and so forth without reading Marx and reading my dear brother Homeo Baba. And I love brother Homeo Baba, but you don't start with that, brother, when you're talking about post-colonialism. You start with Marx. You start with Hobson. You start with Lenin. You start with Rosenberg. You start with those who provided the very context of understanding what colonialism and imperialism was, not Foucault. Anybody want to start with Foucault? I was blessed. Well, I got a long story when I taught in Paris, but boy, if I heard Foucault's name one more time, I said, read him closely and then move on. Don't get stuck, because it just becomes a matter of status in the chatter rather than substance in the thinking.
I want to put a yellow highlighter on something that Cornel said a moment ago, and that is the importance of giving these authors, whether we're talking about Du Bois, or we're talking about Walker, we're talking about Toni Morrison, we're talking about Baldwin, we're talking about Malcolm X, we're talking about Martin Luther King, giving these authors the dignity of treating them like you would treat any other author, which means subjecting their thought and their work and their witness to critical scrutiny. And I have seen this man do it. Because we have taught, we have taught together. We do. We taught together. We have taught Du Bois. We've taught Souls of Black Folk together. And Du Bois gets the same critical scrutiny from Cornell that Dewey gets, and that Lewis gets, and that Newman gets, and that Matthew Arnold gets, and going all the way back to Plato. Even a figure like King, who we so often deify, and Cornel and I have held King up in our public writing together as a profound witness for justice and truth. And yet he had his flaws. Oh, yeah. And yet he has his flaws. And they have to be subjected to inquiry and scrutiny as well. If we deify these figures, we do not do them justice. We had a powerful moment, Cornel, you will remember it, in one of our seminars together, when we exposed our students to Malcolm X's critique of King in the House Negro speech. Some of you will remember what I'm talking about here, in which he doesn't even mention King's name. And we played the speech, the video of the speech for the students, and then we asked the students, who was Malcolm X talking about? Who was the target? And because of the deification of a figure like King, of course, the last thing on their minds was that he had in mind King. And yet that is exactly who he had in mind. What we did there in that moment was education. They learned something important about the profound debate between these two figures, critical figures, in the struggle for racial justice in the 1960s. That's what needs to go on.
We've got a question down here.
Now, looming over this conversation, I dare say, as in fact I think it looms over all such conversations, is the shadow of Alan Bloom, who wrote a book on liberal education called The Closing of the American Mind, as I'm sure you all know. In the book, he makes a rather provocative, I think, point that the generation of sort of American college students at the best universities before the 1960s had less of what he sees as this kind of cancerous moral relativism than students that have filled those halls since. I think Ross Douthat in the New York Times has recently made sort of a similar point. Now, the tricky thing here is that as this, the tricky thing for this argument, I think, is that what makes it so controversial is that it says that as this sort of American, young intellectual elite, essentially, as it has gotten more diverse, it has also gotten more morally relativistic. So I wondered what each of your thoughts were on this provocative claim.
Yeah, well, one is that you have to salute Bloom for his translations of the Republic and his translations of Emile on education. When you read Saul Bellow's book about Bloom, you say, that relativistic, narcissistic cancer cut much deeper than we thought, which is to say, Socrates, you start at home. You don't start by just pointing the finger at the younger generation. You can get there. But if you're going to be Socratic, you're going to say, we have all been shaped by this market-driven culture that generates addiction to idols. What are the ways in which it's operating in me so I am on a continuum with those students that we're after? Because lo and behold, no one ultimately escapes. This is one of the reasons why the artists are so very important. And it's no accident that Bloom himself, when he translates Plato, Plato was an artist. He's not just a political theorist. Rousseau was an artist, and an artist is concerned about wrestling with the fears, insecurities, and anxieties inside one's own soul, and maybe that wrestling will be insightful to those outside. What happened in that text was it created intellectual polarization. You got a lot of name calling, and you're a Nietzschean, and you're a Straussian, and so forth. Let's get beneath the labels. Strauss has something to say, a whole lot to say, not always right. Nietzsche's got a hell of a lot to say, usually wrong, but that's all right. Because when you're that powerfully wrong, you got a role and function to play in the conversation, and it never goes away. I wouldn't say wrong, it's just a difficult challenge they have to wrestle with. So in that sense, I would be very suspicious of trying to ossify or petrify a moment and project it. But if you begin the way Socrates and Montaigne and Rousseau and Kierkegaard and Ellison and Tony, beginning with self and then connected to larger zeitgeist claims, the spirit of the age and so forth, I think it's much better in terms of facilitating a conversation. I don't know what you say about Brother Bloom, though, man.
Well, it's a powerful book, no question about it, and anybody who hasn't read it should read it. And probably this is a good moment. We're on for about 30 years since publication, I suppose. For those of us who read it way back then, or at least had it on our coffee tables when it was fashionable to have it on our coffee tables, should go back and have another look at it. I have not done that recently, so I'm working here from memory. Now, clearly, his critique of what much of what goes on in the culture is on the mark. His critique of contemporary music, a lot to say for it. Relativism, absolutely. He foresaw that we would end up with a very toxic combination of relativism and absolutism, a kind of me generation, anything goes if it feels good, do it culture with a kind of absolutism that condemns anybody who criticizes that. So the Plato, the Socrates is always going to be vulnerable to the absolutism of those who proclaim relativism. All that is on the mark, and it's very powerful. But what Cornel says, I'm afraid, is absolutely right about Bloom himself. And one of the things that you worry about in reading the book is whether Bloom himself is willing to engage and critique the most sophisticated forms of the relativism that in their unsophisticated forms he is so eager to call out. In its vulgar forms, he's willing to call it out. But is he willing to actually question and challenge it in its deeper forms? Or is his worry merely that this relativism abroad in the culture, while probably rooted in some truth about reality, that ultimately there is no objective source of meaning, is dangerous to social institutions? It's something that we have to uphold a noble lie in order to prevent society from being torn apart by it. It's not clear to me that that's not Bloom's view. Now, I can't stick him with it. He's a subtle and, I have to say, in some ways, evasive writer. But I notice that when push comes to shove, he doesn't actually take on Nietzsche. He's willing to note that these young people that he's critical of their music, he's critical of their dress, he's critical of their language, he's critical of their attitudes, and he says that behind all this is a kind of Nietzscheanism. but is he willing to take on Nietzsche? So now I want to know, okay, what's wrong with Nietzsche? I've got some ideas about what's wrong with Nietzsche, as powerful and compelling as I think he is in so many ways, but does Bloom? Or is Bloom himself, I'm going to put it, take this all the way down, is it Bloom himself at the end of the day a Nietzschean who just doesn't want ordinary people to live as if Nietzsche was right? Because that's going to be chaos. So do we have an elitism where Nietzscheanism, skepticism, is for the elite, people like Bloom himself, but belief, faith, the idea that there is moral truth, that's for the masses. Religion, that's for the masses, so that we can have some kind of a decent, socially harmonious society.
I can't defend Alan Bloom, but I will say that when I was in high school, I read that book, and it got me to go to the University of Chicago. So that's a fact that maybe is.
It's a great, I agree, it's a great book. Everybody should read it.
Yep. Other questions?
There's one right there. Pass the mic down. Thank you.
How you doing?
How you doing, my brother?
My question is, from a student's perspective, like how can we overcome this inevitable barrier between not just the students and the professors, but like the students in the context? And the barrier lies in the fact that the society like requires us, or requires our innate like ability to learn and our ability to kind of identify with the context, and like how our success is tied to our grade. And like how can we overcome that and like attempt to challenge and like to begin challenging ourselves and understanding this deeper meaning and overcoming these concepts if we are constantly burdened like with like trying to overcome the fact that our grade is gonna like be affected, and how can we like kind of deeperly how can we understand these concepts like knowing that our grade will be affected whether or not we can kind of understand that? Does that
Oh, yeah, indeed. We appreciate it. Should I take a stab at that, my brother? No, I appreciate that, though. This is my alpha brother, too. I tell you, this 06, brother. I got to get all the way on the edge of my seat for this. Oh, yeah. No, but you see, the difference between coming to a classroom, learning how to die, that's on the quest to greatness. Coming to a classroom, how do I get a good grade? That's on the quest for success. Now, the challenge is, how do you try to stay on both tracks, right, simultaneously, but understand there's different dynamics of each track? You see, Miles Davis dropped out of Juilliard, didn't he? Was that a bad thing? At the moment, it was, until let that brother start blowing his horn and listen to Charlie Parker. He learned how to die in Birdland, became great. You see, some folks stay in Juilliard. You know who actually went to Juilliard was the pianist for the Funkadelics in Parliament. I used to travel with him, Brother Bernie. He graduated from Juilliard and went to George Clinton and funked the world up. He was on the way to greatness.
That's funk with an N.
Okay. We can break that down for him, Brother Rob.
I don't want to have to be organizing a protest.
But the crucial thing is that so many folk in our society, they lose sight of greatness for success. And to be great is in no way identical with success. I know successful vocalists who cannot sing in tune, who make millions of dollars. Nat King Cole shakes in his grave. Frank Sinatra does. So does Sarah Vaughan. So does Aretha. Oh, Lord have mercy. Exactly. They were great. Greatness. Greatness is a very feeble thing in any historical moment. But the professor, when you come into classes, they want you to be a great human being and then a successful person, but also a citizen who can put public interest and common good beyond just private interest in one's own individual gain. You see what I'm saying there? And that's a wrestling. And you need others for that. You need your friends, your partners, your family, the folk in your mosques and synagogues and churches and other civic institutions to keep you accountable. That's one of the things, our deep friendship, we keep each other accountable. And it's a beautiful thing. And you can see the strength and the fortitude and the determination that is reinforced when you have those kinds of loves coming at you. Yeah, go ahead.
So it's a very, very important question for all of you. I'm glad you put it. You're going to have a degree from the American University. You will eat. You'll be all right. Now, it's perfectly fine. I'm not saying there's anything wrong. I don't even think Cornel would say there's anything wrong with aspiring to be chief operating officer or chief executive officer of Google, or a United States senator or a governor, or a university president, or the head of your activist organization, whether you're a conservative or progressive. All those things are fine to aspire to. That's fine. And if that's what you're interested in, I hope you get there. I'm pulling for you. But not at any cost. Now, the easy thing to say is, and this is certainly true, but it's easy, which is don't get there dishonestly. Don't get there by cheating. Your mother will tell you that. She'll be absolutely right about that. But more than that, don't get there if it means sacrificing, even short of cheating and lying and that, sacrificing key elements of your humanity. If it means you have to lay aside the leading of the examined life, you need to be willing to sacrifice to live the richest and deepest life that you can live, even if that sacrifice means you're not going to be COO or CEO of Google, or you're not going to be United States Senator, you're not going to be a university president. Maybe you'll get there. Maybe the sacrifice won't be demanded. I don't know. Only God knows that. But if it is, you have to be prepared to pay it. Something else I would say to you, all of you. Cornel talked about how the conservatives these days, they all listen to Fox News. The progressives, they all listen to MSNBC. We're all in our silos, listening, being reinforced in whatever it is we believe. Please cultivate friendships. Cultivate friendships like ours with people you disagree with. If you are progressive and secular, reach out. You find an evangelical Protestant Christian friend, and you listen to them. Don't just preach at them. Listen to them and let them get to know you and how you ended up where you are. If you're that evangelical Christian, you reach out to a secular progressive friend. Make a friend. Cultivate that relation, and not just one. Get to know people. And it goes without saying across the racial divide and so forth, but build trust with people so that you can challenge each other and hold each other accountability. If you haven't built trust, if you haven't built a relationship, then the challenge is going to feel like an assault. And a lot of what goes on college campuses, the provocation, everything, it feels like an assault because there's no trust. There's no relationships. But if you build a relationship, a deep friendship, you love the other person, you appreciate them, you understand their contributions, then you can challenge each other and hold each other accountable. There's not a person in this room who can, including me, who can't benefit from more cultivation of friendship and building of trust with people you disagree with about very fundamental things and who will challenge you and allow you to challenge them.
So in discussing the importance of a liberal education, how do we confront the ableism that is often living inside of that, and the standardized process of testing and education that is the admissions ticket to liberal education institutions that often actively discriminates against students with physical or learning disabilities who would, in no doubt, excel in your classrooms and excel when discussing the very topics we've discussed tonight?
Deeply appreciate that question. When I talked about any ideology that loses sight of the humanity of people, that ableism is as wrong as evil as any other isms that lose sight of the humanity of people. Ageism, I especially can experience it as I get older, But I mean, this is very serious in this regard. But it's a matter of intellectual moral and political pressure brought to bear in terms of the organization of space and the ways in which people have access to that space, and dot, 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 dot. So I would say that your point is a very, very crucial one. It's not a matter of just adding on. It's not adding an ism. It's a deepening of a human embrace. And that's what is so crucial for me.
So, of course, I believe everything that Cornel said about the importance of not losing sight of people's humanity, no matter what. But I believe, I think it's empirically verifiable, that people have different levels of ability. And I think that can and should be taken into account in the educational system. Now, do we do it perfectly? No. We don't even do it close to perfectly. And part of that problem we are now beginning to overcome, just with learning, just with knowledge, so that we do not classify people as less capable of learning in virtue of certain learning disabilities that they have that can be overcome or can be met, or accommodations that we can make that enable them to live up to their potential. I love having really super talented students in my classes. I love that. Any professor will tell you that he or she does. If not, they're either a saint or they're lying to you. Okay? That's great. It's wonderful. The levels of conversation you can have are just unbelievable. So I like teaching at Princeton. I know I would like teaching at the American University. Cornel likes teaching at Harvard. He liked teaching at Princeton even better, and he's welcome back whenever he wants. But what it's important for me to recognize, and what's important for the educational system to recognize, for our institutions to recognize, is that there are students who are capable of being parts of those conversations for whom accommodations need to be made to make it possible for them. And so our standardized testing is not, as it's currently maintained, a good tool, because sometimes people are weeded out who really should be part of that conversation. Now, there are people who shouldn't be at Princeton because they're really not able to do the work that we require at Princeton, or that the American University, the work that is required here. Now, I want everybody to lead an examined life, and I'm one of these people. I have a really radical view about this. It's very fashionable today to say, well, not everybody should go to college. I've got the really unfashionable view to say, I think everybody should go to college. Even people whose careers and vocations are in areas where you don't need a college education to do that. And that's because I don't see a college education as instrumental to getting a job. I see it as enhancing, making available to us richer opportunities for leading the examined life, and that goes for everybody. But there's a legitimate stratification institutionally and sometimes within institutions that just takes into account the reality that people have different talents and different levels of achievement and ability to participate in conversations at different levels.
We've got a question right here. We got a question right here. In the front.
Thank you. So, Dr. West, you said you taught in prisons for like, I think 37 years. And my education on the college level started in prison. And I'm scheduled to graduate in May from Goucher College through the Goucher Prison Education Partnership. And thank you. The question I have for you, due to the Second Chance Act, the Pell Grant, it's about 60, I think, colleges and universities nationwide now. How do we broaden that? Because it's a large group of people in our society that's left out and not given that opportunity to get education. And I know, as he just explained, my life is examined now through the courses that I've taken in school. And I think we need to provide that to more people nationwide. So how do we broaden and give more people opportunities, whether it's at the community college level or four-year institution throughout the United States?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that powerful question. I salute your witness, though, brother. Your reputation precedes you. That the word got out, that your powerful defense of a liberal education set such a high standard that Robbie and I needed to really do some serious work to get close to it. And that's precisely because, just like when Socrates encounters Thrasymachus, that when you encounter the life of the mind, it ain't no game. Everything's at stake. The formation of yourself, your soul, your mind, the memories of those who came before, and the visions of what is to come, unborn as well as the born. And so once one has that kind of existential investment, a deep personal investment, then waiting for Godot is something that folk want to see 2 weeks rather than just one. And it's not a matter of who Samuel Beckett is. You don't have to know who Samuel Beckett is. All I know is Dee and Go-Go make a whole lot of sense to me in this cell. Trying to create some kind of communication, the breakdown of it, the distrust, the need for solidarity, that goes on in that magnificent play. And so in that regard, for me, the important thing is actually how to recognize the degree to which those who have been viewed as on the outskirts of education become the very starting point for what a real value of education is. And their voices, your voice and other voices, become heard. And so to the degree to which, I mean, what we did in Rawway with the STEP program, where we take the classes and gain access to the degrees. The Peony Green program that we had in Garden City and Trenton State. We were talking, where's my Trenton brother? There he is right there. Exactly, with the Trenton State prison where we taught every week. It's those kind of things, what we're trying to do right now in Norfolk, where Malcolm X was, right outside of Boston, to make sure the critical mind, the energy, and the Socratic elements come to the fore behind bars, because those bars actually are shattered symbolically, intellectually, artistically, even though you're still inside. And in the end, of course, all of us have a death sentence in time and space. So it's not as if you're going to get out of time and space alive. So you got to come to terms with those other kinds of bars in terms of dread and death and despair and disappointment and catastrophe and calamity and all the things that go into the death sentence that we human beings and mortals have. But I salute your work and your witness and your example.
Yeah, and I want to say God bless you, and also salute you for your example and for the witness you bear. One of the points that I think needs to be made is that, I say this as a Christian, but I think this is something that people of all faiths should be able to affirm, and that is nobody should be written off. Nobody. You know, we human beings, as Cornel said, quoting back, we fail and then we just try to fail better. You know, there are probably a lot of good reasons I should have been in prison. I wasn't. You were. Right? I mean, but how many of us have lived pristine lives? Not very many. We fail and we try to do better. So I think attention to people who are in prison or have been in prison and making opportunities for this kind of education, not just skill acquisition, that's important. People need jobs, not just information, that's important too, but actually liberal education. And that's why I salute Cornel for his work in the prisons on this very stuff. What he's teaching is not computer science. He goes into prison and he teaches Plato and St. Augustine and Machiavelli and Hobbes. You know, he gives students in the prisons access to that kind of learning. Now, Cornel did me the honor of inviting me to go to Rawway with him to teach on St. Augustine, which I said I'd be delighted to do. And I was very interested in just having a sense of what that experience is like, interacting with men, and then the administration vetoed my, you remember this, Cornel? Oh, yeah, they vetoed my coming. But one of the things that has always struck me about that is the life of Malcolm X, and not just the prison component. What that's part of is a lesson about transformation. So let's look at Mr. Little. Let's look at Malcolm X. He starts out on the streets. He starts out in trouble. He starts out with serious thuggishness. He finds God through Elijah Muhammad. He becomes a Muslim, becomes serious about his faith, Nation of Islam. Transforms his life, helps him to transform the lives of many others. But then he sees some things that he doesn't like going on, including Elijah Muhammad. And that causes him to rethink, to challenge his beliefs. And he leaves. Great risk, great cost. And then he doesn't abandon his Muslim faith. He looks for ways to enrich it. And he makes the Hajj to Mecca, which is a transformative experience. So he's transformed again for a third time, really. Now, he could have been written off when he was in prison. But fortunately, he was able to lead a life that had these transformations and enrichments, and to bear a certain very important kind of witness. You know, including the witness that he bore when he said, on the Hajj, I began to realize that race really doesn't matter all that much. Cornel wrote a book called Race Matters. It does matter. Malcolm X's message here is race doesn't matter all that much. It's our humanity fundamentally that does matter. Now, there are reasons why Malcolm X hadn't seen that before. We can understand that. But that experience was transformative. He was open to it. Had he been closed to it, it never would have happened. He was open to it, and it happened. Well, we are all on a journey. We are all capable of improvement. We are all capable of transformation. Our journey will be different from his. Mine will be different from yours. But we're all on it if we don't shut it down, if we don't close our minds, close ourselves off to that kind of transformation. And liberal education is a way of ensuring that we don't close it down, that we don't become dogmatic.
Friends, the time has flown. We are now past our time, and we have a wonderful reception and opportunity for us to socialize with our guests. So I just want to say the two of you are our teachers, and we want to say thank you to both of you for spending this time with us. We are very grateful. Please join me in thanking Professor George and Professor